Okay, so we're going to record, and tonight we're going to go the following order. I'm going to take what I'll call science piece, and I move that to number one. Then Marjorie is going to cover the astrology side, and then I put the meditation radically happy piece at the end, just to change things up. So let's see how we do here.
And I'm not doing astrology, I'm doing poetry and spirituality.
Right.
So there.
Right, I stand corrected. So what we're going to do is one of the criticisms of science, of Western science in particular, is that it really doesn't explain why things occur. It deals with how things occur. So Isaac Newton was attacked because he said, well, you've just got this set of equations which describe how things interact with one another through this force you call gravity. And gravity, there never was a term gravity. There was always the term gravity in the sense of Latin gravitas, meaning weighty or profound or deep or whatever. But there was never a term called gravity for the force that it would attract different things to one another. So Newton came up with that. And he said, look, I don't know why it works. I do know this is how it works. And it matches all of these observations that people like Kepler and Copernicus and Tycho Brahe and all of these people for millennia had done. And so, for me, that's good enough, but I'm going to ignore the why. Same thing happened with electromagnetism when Faraday and Maxwell and Volt and Ampere and all of these different people were dealing with electricity. They came up with a set of equations for how it behaved, but no one had any idea of why it behaved that way. And so that's always been a criticism of science. And what we're going to try and do tonight is run off and look a little bit at the flip side to it of why things occur and what Ron Cowen did to try and bridge that gap. One of the key things to keep in mind here is we're partly what we're dealing with is it'll show up as called the mind-body problem. So if we look around, you've got a body, I see this body, and I've got these eyes, and behind the eyes, people imagine there's a little person there of some sort, and that's the mind. The mind is sitting there, and here's the body, and the two things seem to be different from one another, and so it goes. So we're going to try and understand this mind-body problem, in more detail, as you'll see. And I've teed up here let me see if I can get to it first. Oh, wait, hold on one sec. Got to do one thing. Here it is. Okay, now I can do it. So the title of this video is Consciousness Primary to Reality? Is consciousness primary to reality? We'll be talking about the terms awareness or consciousness or mindfulness, mind, versus reality. So here we go.
The belief that consciousness or awareness is fundamental to reality is an ancient philosophical idea. It can be found in the writings of many Eastern and contemplative traditions, such as Buddhism and Hinduism, as well as in Western traditions, such as in the philosophy of ancient Greece, in Platonic idealism. A fundamentality of consciousness in reality is a metaphysical position that has been defended throughout history by scholars and sages alike, and in various interesting cases, driven not by ideological or religious convictions, but by philosophical deduction, introspection, and ontological parsimony. The Before we continue, we need to define consciousness. When we think of our own consciousness, many things may come to mind. Our senses of sight and taste, smell and touch, our rich palette of emotions, or our ability to think about concepts and ideas. To philosophers, however, the word consciousness can be simply defined as experience. It is commonly said that something is conscious if there is something it is like to be that thing, no matter how simple or sophisticated that experience might be. It is in this way that we will be using the word consciousness today. In recent decades, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental element of reality has made an unexpected return to Western academic thought, enjoying a new credibility among respected scientists and philosophers. It has been the subject of both popular and academic books, philosophical papers, and scientific monographs. So why has this ancient and esoteric idea returned to our modern thinking? Is it true? And what might it mean for us? This is the story of how consciousness in Western academic thought went from an insignificant illusion to a leading candidate for the ultimate ground of existence. To understand the recent resurgence of fundamental views of consciousness, we need to first go back to the turn of the 20th century, when a similar flowering of such views was occurring in Western philosophy. Our story begins with one of the leading academic figures of that time, Bertrand Russell. A British polymath, Russell's interests spanned philosophy, science, mathematics, and literature, and yet it was Russell's philosophical work on the ancient mind-body problem, now rediscovered by academics decades later, that has now sparked a renaissance in considering a deep place for consciousness in reality. In his 1927 book, The Analysis of Matter, Russell focused on the enduring question of how mind relates to matter. He adopted a stance on matter similar to that taken by earlier philosophers, including Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, Immanuel Kant, and later by Arthur Schopenhauer. These thinkers had argued that in spite of the richly detailed description of the world provided by physics, the physical account actually offers no explanation of the nature of matter. The core of the position is that physics tells us not what matter is, but only what it does. Consider a particle. Physics tells us that particles have the properties of mass, charge, and spin. Yet these properties tell us only about how a particle will relate to its environment, and nothing about the intrinsic nature of the particle, what it is in itself. This, it turns out, is true of everything that physical science tells us about the world. In the popular understanding, physical science reveals the essential contents of reality. However, in actuality, science reveals only behaviors and relationships, what we might call the causal structure of nature. And while it has proved highly valuable in countless practical ways, the intrinsic nature of reality, what our physical equations are actually describing, remains an unsolved mystery. As Russell writes, quote, "We know nothing about the intrinsic quality of physical events," end quote. But does physics actually require an intrinsic ground in order to be complete? Perhaps structure and relationship are simply all there is to reality. This view, however, falls apart on closer inspection. As the philosopher Hedda Hasselmalch points out, quote, "For there to be a relation, there must be two things being related. Otherwise, the relation is empty, a show that goes on without performers, or a castle constructed out of thin air." She continues, "Physical structure must be realized or implemented by some stuff or substance that is itself not purely structural. Otherwise, there would be no clear difference between physical and mere mathematical structure, or between the concrete universe and a mere abstraction." End quote. This fact was not overlooked by the late great physicist Stephen Hawking, who famously pointed out that we have no idea what it is that, quote, breathes fire into the equations of physics and gives reality to the universe. It would seem that there must be some essential ground to which our physical equations actually point, and without it, as Russell argued, our account of reality will never be truly complete.
Have you ever heard of an economy being taxed into prosperity? I haven't. In 2016, Tennessee had a $2 billion.
After presenting this view on matter, Russell went on to observe that the elusive intrinsic nature of the world is, in a conspicuous way, analogous to the mysterious reality of consciousness. We know that it's there, and yet it stubbornly resists all attempts to capture it through objective or behavioral processes. Russell argued that our epistemological blind spots in physics to get at the nature of what things are themselves is precisely the same reason that physical approaches to consciousness seem doomed to fail. Intrinsic natures simply cannot be captured through a purely physical approach. Russell did not suggest that consciousness was the intrinsic nature of reality, but instead argued for a position that has become known as neutral monism, in which reality has a single underlying nature that is neither mental nor physical, but capable of being expressed in these two different ways. Much like interiors and exteriors, in Russell's account, the mental and the physical imply and necessitate each other as reflections of a single, hence monistic, underlying nature. In the 1920s, Russell's arguments sparked interest among several leading academics of the time, most notably in Arthur Eddington. Like Russell, Eddington was another titan of early 20th century science. As a physicist and mathematician, he was famous for demonstrating the validity of Einstein's theory of general relativity by setting up an ingenious experiment that involved the observation of stars as their light is curved by the mass of the sun. Eddington was once heralded as one of only 3 people in the world to truly understand Einstein's general relativity, and Einstein complimented his presentations on the subject as the clearest in any language. But aside from his scientific contributions, Eddington was also a celebrated philosopher of science with a deep interest in the mind-body problem. In 1927, at the same time that Russell was developing his neutral monism, Eddington was invited to give a series of lectures at Edinburgh University in Scotland for the prestigious Gifford Lectures, a long-running annual event considered by many to be among the highest honours in a philosopher's professional career. It was in these lectures, and then in his later writings, that Eddington outlined a compelling solution to the mind-body problem. It was a new synthesis of an ancient philosophical position known as panpsychism, a name given to views throughout history which place mind or consciousness as a deep and ubiquitous feature of reality. In these lectures, Eddington argued that there is only one plausible candidate for the intrinsic nature of the physical world: consciousness. Like Russell and others before him, Eddington recognized that science gives no description of the intrinsic nature of the physical world. His primary contribution, however, was to argue convincingly to many that consciousness is precisely the required candidate to fill this awkward gap in our knowledge. Eddington put forward an argument for panpsychism, which is known today as the intrinsic nature argument. This argument, now recently rediscovered, has seen panpsychism return as a respectable theory, and a view that now enjoys growing support from scientists and philosophers alike. To explain the intrinsic nature argument, we first begin with an account of consciousness. It is sometimes said that the existence of consciousness is the one thing we know for sure about reality. Perhaps the most famous philosophical dictum of all time is that of René Descartes' "I think, therefore I am." Whatever we believe we may know about the outer universe, there is only one feature of reality that is utterly invulnerable to any and all doubt: our consciousness. The world might be very
That's
different to
debatable.
what our senses describe. Maybe we are a brain in a vat, or living in some kind of simulation. Maybe we're just dreaming. And yet, for all of the ways we could be mistaken about reality, we can be sure only that consciousness exists. But other than its existence, what else do we know about consciousness? Eddington argued that we know at least one thing concretely about consciousness, that it is an intrinsic nature. In our unmediated access to it, consciousness is a reality that we apprehend directly and without inference. Consciousness exists uniquely to and for itself. We might even go so far as to say that consciousness is the only part of reality that we truly understand, because only in our consciousness do we have access to the intrinsic nature of at least one small part of the universe.
Have you ever heard of an economy being taxed into prosperity? I have.
But why then believe consciousness could be the intrinsic nature of all reality? As it turns out, consciousness is both the only intrinsic nature we know or can conceive of. Only consciousness exists to and for itself, and it would seem that this same property is required to ground the physical world in reality. Previously, Russell had described our need for an account of the intrinsic qualities of physical events, and yet it would seem that qualities are the exclusive domain of consciousness. Many philosophers, past and present, have argued that a true account of consciousness requires an expansion of our physical picture of nature, and according to the intrinsic nature argument, physics calls for precisely this expansion in order to be complete. For these reasons, Eddington regarded nature's grounding interiority as a perfect candidate for the otherwise mysterious interiority of our minds. Through this approach, mind and matter could be unified, the interaction problems of dualism could be averted, and the elegant economic ontology of monism could be restored. As Eddington concluded, quote, "All through the physical world runs that unknown content which must surely be the stuff of our consciousness," end quote. An idea lost to history. It is arguably due to the turbulent events of the 20th century that this earlier flowering of panpsychism came to an end. In the wake of the First World War, a dramatic shift took place in analytic philosophy with the rise of logical positivism. Academics argued that philosophy must now dispense with metaphysical musings about the nature of reality and earn its keep by providing actionable contributions to science. The consequence was that introspective and intuitive knowledge were sidelined, and not surprisingly, the question of consciousness once again faded into the background. During this time, another similar development was also underway in psychology with the rise of behaviorism. With hopes of finally achieving the status of the hard sciences, B.F. Skinner and other influential psychologists directed the powerful objectivity of empiricism to human behavior. With great ambition, psychologists now predicted that every datum of the mind could be entirely understood by reduction to environmental inputs and behavioral outputs. For decades in the field of psychology, even mentioning consciousness raised eyebrows. As the field advanced, however, it became increasingly clear that denying mental states left out the true essence of psychology. Sensations, emotions, feelings, and desires, these were what made us who we are as living beings with conscious minds. While in some relative obscurity, consciousness continued to be discussed by philosophers, It wasn't until the 1980s that consciousness re-entered the broader academic discussion. In the late 1950s, the biologist Francis Crick shot to fame for his role in discovering the structure of DNA. With his place in the pages of history secured, by the 1980s, Crick hoped to surpass even this discovery by solving that other great mystery of life, consciousness. Now, together with his colleague, neuroscientist Christoph Koch, the two scientists announced the beginning of a new scientific program dedicated to finally demonstrating how brains become conscious. Through their study and the research it inspired, a great many new discoveries about cognition and neuroanatomy were made. And yet, in spite of their achievements, how any quantitative description of the objective processes of the brain could somehow lead to a qualitative description of subjective experiences remained a mystery. It gradually dawned on them that any physical theory of consciousness is forced to take no less than a leap of pure faith from the objectively physical to the subjectively mental, what the philosopher Joseph Levine had called the explanatory gap. A century of studying the brain had provided an impressive and extremely useful science of correlations. We learned the specific brain states associated with recognizing faces, solving problems, feeling pleasure, pain, and excitement. Yet the central question remained, exactly how do physical brain states produce mental ones? In an important sense, a century of neuroscience had brought us no closer to understanding this mystery. As the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio reflected in an article for Scientific American, quote, "One question towers above all others in the life sciences. How does the set of processes we call mind emerge from the activity of the organ we call brain?" End quote. The effort to understand the nature of consciousness seemed once again to have encountered an impasse. And yet, while Crick and others collided with the ancient mind-body problem, several philosophers were now rediscovering strands of Russell and Eddington's previous work. Among these philosophers were Thomas Nagel, Galen Strawson, David Chalmers, and William Seeger. It seemed that between them, Russell and Eddington had discovered an attractive middle path for solving what was now being called the hard problem of consciousness. While their approach had been convincing and influential to several leading academics of the early 20th century, as neither a form of materialism or dualism, the nuance of the Russell-Eddington approach had been overlooked by much of the mind-body debate of the time. Eventually, it had been obscured by a turbulent century of great wars and revolutions in psychology and philosophy, which were hostile to the issue of consciousness as a legitimate subject of inquiry. Now, however, in the latter part of the 20th century, hostility towards metaphysics had largely subsided, the limits of behaviorism had become obvious, and the imposed restrictions on philosophy were challenged by a new generation of philosophers. It was now finally becoming clear that purely behavioral or physical approaches could never explain consciousness. A growing minority of first philosophers and later neuroscientists began to argue that consciousness could never emerge from exclusively physical processes. That consciousness, in some unrefined or proto form, must exist inherently within the natural world, a fundamental aspect of reality. Space, time, mass, and charge are all considered to be fundamental features of the world, so called because they cannot be defined by anything more basic. Historically, the advancement of science has always led to the introduction of new fundamentals, and with them, the expansion of our scientific picture of the world. Now, for a small but growing cadre of thinkers, we are now at another such critical moment in history, when a new fundamental must be recognized. This time, it is consciousness. Instead of being a field-specific problem in neuroscience, the mind-body problem looks increasingly to be an issue that extends to our entire understanding of the physical world. As the philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote, quote, "The mind-body problem is not just a local problem having to do with the relation between mind, brain, and behavior in living animal organisms. It invades our understanding of the entire cosmos and its history." End quote. While panpsychism has now returned as a respectable theory, it is not without its critics. Panpsychism, for many, is just too weird to be true. And yet the weirdness of a theory is not evidence against it. Indeed, a similar association once cast a shadow over quantum physics, a field derided by Einstein for its, quote, spooky actions at a distance. Today, quantum physics is widely regarded as the most powerful physical theory ever conceived, and its so-called spooky actions have been widely demonstrated. Indeed, Einstein's own theory of special relativity tells us that time slows down for objects as they accelerate, a now scientifically demonstrable fact that is at the same time profoundly counterintuitive, with no basis in our ordinary experience of reality. The panpsychist view that the interior quality of our minds is continuous with the intrinsic inner nature of the world might sound very strange, and yet history teaches us to keep an open mind to counterintuitive theories and judge them not by how they seem to us, but by their elegance and explanatory power. To the panpsychist, it is materialism that is the unintelligible position. Through the Russell-Eddington approach, we can see that physics less reveals the nature of reality than it is silent on the question. Taking its physical description as the totality of what exists begins to look like a classic case of confusing the map with the territory, and the resulting materialism less an account of the nature of reality than the absence of one. Now, to a growing number of thinkers, only panpsychism unifies the mental and physical facts of existence and places them in necessity of each other. Alongside concerns about the strangeness of this view, there are common misconceptions about what panpsychism actually entails. If consciousness is somehow fundamental, must we now believe that rocks, tables, and chairs have conscious minds? In fact, no serious thinker has defended such claims. A complex mind requires a complex organization with the specific capacity of aggregating a fundamental aspect of consciousness. There are now several scientific theories which begin with a fundamental view of consciousness. One such theory that has been widely discussed is integrated information theory, or IIT. Developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, IIT is considered by many to be the leading scientific theory of consciousness today. It is also conspicuously a form of panpsychism. The theory asserts that information, by its very nature, has both a physical and mental pole, and that when information becomes integrated inside a system, an integrated consciousness emerges. In this respect, IIT is reminiscent of Russell's neutral monism, where the physical and mental are unified aspects of a more primary reality of information. Tononi and his colleagues have developed methods for gauging the integrated information present in the brains of patients in their laboratory. They appear to show that the presence of greater amounts of integrated information does indeed correlate with the presence of consciousness. IIT also successfully predicts which centers of the brain are associated with so central to consciousness in humans, even though it has far fewer neurons than the cerebellum, which can actually be removed with only minor disruption to consciousness. The reason, according to IIT, is that the neurons of this area are significantly less integrated than those of the cortex. And this is precisely what examining the neural structure of the cerebellum reveals. Many more neurons than the cortex, yet much less integration between them. But Tononi's theory does not confine consciousness to brains. IIT predicts that integrated information, and therefore some amount of consciousness, exists all around us in all sorts of things. According to the theory, every living cell, every electronic circuit, even a proton consisting of just 3 elementary particles, possesses something, albeit but a glimmer, of consciousness. As Tononi has put it, quote, consciousness is a fundamental property like mass or charge. Wherever there is an entity with multiple states, there is some consciousness. You need a special structure to get a lot of it, but consciousness is everywhere. It is a fundamental property, end quote. Tononi's theory does have its critics, including among supporters of panpsychism. For example, his theory takes no account of the interconnected reality of the quantum world, and some increasingly argue that quantum effects, such as entanglement between brain processes, may yet be discovered to play an important role in the unified nature of conscious minds. But whether or not IIT is correct, it successfully demonstrated to the scientific community that testable forms of panpsychism can be developed. It also revealed that such a theory could have extremely important medical applications, such as determining if consciousness exists in unresponsive coma patients, or the full effectivity of anesthetics. Philosophers at the Qualia Research Institute have also thought deeply about the broader implications of Tononi's theory. According to the philosopher Michael Johnson, IIT predicts that consciousness could exist far beyond the scale of humans and animals, and might in fact be present in massive cosmological phenomena. Black holes, for example, the surfaces of which are predicted to contain massive amounts of integrated information, could also have an enormous amount of consciousness. Johnson also tentatively speculated that for the same reason, the Big Bang could itself have been a massive experience, a climax of cosmic symmetry echoing into infinity. Neuroscientist Christoph Koch, who began his career as a materialist, working alongside Francis Crick, now takes panpsychism very seriously. Describing his radical shift in perspective, he writes, quote, the entire cosmos is suffused with sentience. We are surrounded and immersed in consciousness. It is in the air we breathe, the soil we tread on, the bacteria that colonize our intestines, and the brain that enables us to think, end quote.
I'm going to make a bold statement and say that doing a TEDx talk is going to be the most transformative and uplifting experience.
Panpsychism and the combination problem. Perhaps the most credible challenge to panpsychism is what is known as the combination problem. This challenge to panpsychism was first raised over a century ago by one of the founders of modern psychology, William James. While James himself was actually an advocate of panpsychism, he pointed out that any panpsychist theory needs to explain how more elemental conscious entities combine to create more sophisticated minds like ours. But how could a conscious entity combine with another? As the philosopher Sam Coleman has pointed out, it is the essence of a conscious entity to have a specific viewpoint that excludes other viewpoints. Under this definition, it's very difficult to conceive how multiple simple conscious entities could combine to become one. For its critics, the combination problem serves as a decisive refutation to panpsychism, perhaps equally unsurmountable as the hard problem of consciousness itself. And yet, as defenders of panpsychism have pointed out, we already have highly convincing evidence that mental combination does occur. The best example comes from neuroscience. Many experiments have shown that under specific circumstances, the two hemispheres of the brain can become isolated from each other. In such split brain cases, a fascinating observation is made. Each of the two separate hemispheres appears to have their own separate consciousness, capable of very different personalities, desiring very different things. Reconnect the hemispheres, and these two minds apparently merge to create our normal awareness. Such split brain cases reveal, at least in principle, that conscious entities can combine to create larger minds. Explaining exactly how this occurs would be a task for a future science of consciousness, and yet the fact that mental combination takes place would appear to have already been demonstrated. Cosmic mind. Historically, panpsychists have attributed consciousness or mentality to nature's fundamental entities. But what if the most fundamental entity is not a particle, but the universe itself? Philip Goff has pointed out that our historical tendency to view smaller things as more fundamental might be a mere assumption, a tendency known as smallism. Developing on a view known as priority monism, Goff argues that we might equally take the universe itself as the primary ontological primitive. After all, it seems quite natural to see the universe itself as the most fundamental reality. Goff offers a version of panpsychism he calls cosmopsychism, in which the universe itself may be the subject of a singular consciousness that is refracted into individual minds like our own. After all, if panpsychist theories are to take account of modern physics, they must transcend the atomistic thinking of previous centuries and now accommodate the holistic fabric of reality revealed in the quantum. Might the probabilistic field that underpins classical reality now be thought of as perturbations in consciousness, that they are, as the philosopher Andrés Gómez Emilson has put it, fields of qualia? In Bertrand Russell's early work, he had been highly critical of a position known as ontological idealism, a philosophical view in which the physical world consists entirely of projections in consciousness. And yet the species of panpsychism developed from his later work in some ways has a lot in common with ontological idealism. In very general terms, panpsychism argues that the physical world contains a fundamental aspect of consciousness. Ontological idealism, on the other hand, views a fundamental consciousness as containing the physical world. Through this framing, we can see that the two positions are split on the issue of whether consciousness contains the world or vice versa. And yet the real difference between these views may come down to little more than a matter of perspective. That just like interiors and exteriors, mind and matter imply and necessitate each other. Indeed, it has often gone unrecognized that the modern Russell-Eddington panpsychism is itself a form of idealism. The apparent conflict between panpsychism and idealism might be just a matter of from which side we choose to begin. Ontological idealism has often been criticized for failing to grant sufficient reality to the physical world, and for failing to account for the deep regularity between our individual perceptions of nature, why the world is so consistent and predictable. The emerging panpsychism, on the other hand, preserves our highly useful and detailed physical description of nature, yet grounds it in reality. It also finally offers an explanation for why the physical world requires consciousness as the essential realizer of physics and the basis upon which anything at all exists. Past academic revolutions, such as the discovery that Earth orbits the Sun, or that life evolved from a common ancestor, resituated our sense of place in the universe. During these times, millions of people paused in their lives and looked around them and saw the world for the first time in a new way. Many thinkers now believe that we are on the verge of another historic shift in our perspective. Yet this time, the proposed shift is different. It is an ontological revolution that could not be more intimate to the core of our most inner sense of self. For over 300 years in the West, reasonable-minded thinkers have adopted a materialist view in which a mature acceptance of the received facts of science dispel all previous notions of human specialness or our centrality on the cosmic stage, that we live in an arbitrary and unfeeling reality of inert physical laws, in which we drift in an immeasurable cosmic void, separate and isolated from each other and from true reality. The compromise of this view and the strength it took to accept it were seen as virtues in our Promethean willingness to seek and face reality. Now, once more, it seems that reality is yet stranger and deeper than previously imagined. But instead of further decentralizing humanity and the conscious subject, the emerging view offers a break in this tradition. It recasts the physical world, not as an inert matrix of matter, but as a tapestry of qualities. And for the first time since the dawn of the Copernican revolution, our significance in reality is promoted. In the emerging view, consciousness, the context of all value, meaning, and significance, is not an arbitrary illusion of biological evolution. It is core to the ground of existence. If consciousness is a fundamental property, then in our most intimate and essential identity as conscious beings, we are continuous with the essential nature of reality. More than ever, we are at home in the universe, as part of that tapestry of qualities and the intrinsic experiencing aspect of the universe itself.
Okay, so, oops, hold on.
That's gotta go.
I think we're done. Okay, so there you have, an introductory piece on what we're talking about here. And what I'm going to do now
We'll
is,
see if anybody would like to say.
yeah, first of all, any comments from anybody?
Welcome, Cheryl.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I don't have my camera. Hi, Bruce. Hi, everybody. I think this is like, spot on, trying to understand what is consciousness, how it exists, why it exists, and how to define it. It is the, 2022 or 21st century, I think, question that seems like everybody's asking that today, or a lot of people. And so, yeah, it's pretty interesting.
The video seemed to indicate to me that if there were no humans, there would still be consciousness.
Right.
Mhm.
But that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to go through what Ron Cowen observed, and we're going to see how it plays out with what we just saw in this nice little summary. So what I'm going to do here,
I will ask a question because I think you'll probably get to it, but
okay,
can consciousness move towards objects that are not human?
yes. We're going to see that in just a second. Let me just get over to, okay. So what Ron observed, he was able to go into very deep meditation and looked down on actually the granularity of compartments of space. So space is made up of compartments. It's not continuous. And when we have particles, the particles hop from compartment to compartment. So he observed the following, that the walls of the space compartments are actually covered with information. And these he represented, there's some pictures on our resources webpage I'll go to, but that there's simply are these little blocks he observed that cover the walls of the space compartments. And they can consist of information, meaning both algorithms and data. Okay, and it's all throughout all of space. He also observed when he looked at some particles, for example, he looked at an electron when we were looking at this double slit experiment, and the electron itself was covered with little pieces of information. And so the information that's there is scanning all the time in the surroundings. And it responds when there's a change, when something is different than what it just observed on the previous scan. It looks like these scans occur in these so-called compactified dimensions. That's why they've never been observed. And they could very well be instantaneous. That is much faster than the speed of light. The information seems to cover not simply the electron, but all the other sorts of particles we've seen, these subquarks and quarks and protons and neutrons and the nuclei of atoms and on, going on up, okay? And so just to stop, to go right there, suppose I look at a rock, just a rock made up of, just some magma, an igneous rock. Well, it's got these space compartments that contain the little subquarks that make up this rock. And so here we have this information all through it. So the rock, in this sense, has some awareness. Okay, it has the information, and in itself, even though we would view it as inert, it's not biologically alive. It's not biologically sentient, but it's there, and it has this information or awareness around it. By the way, the collective unconsciousness is what Jung always talked about. And so if we looked at all of the space compartments making up, the entire universe, then that is a way to frame what is the collective unconsciousness. It's all of these different little pieces of information scanning and doing their thing everywhere. By the way, the reason for mentioning the rock that I just talked about was those of you that have been to Japan, the Japanese have a native religion called Shinto. So they have, for example, a nice rock formation. So they have a Shinto shrine there for the rocks, or there's a nice glade of trees, or there's a nice pond or lake. And so all of these things are worshipped by the Japanese that are followers of Shinto. Many Westerners, for example, make fun of this, but here is an argument for why the Japanese were onto something, that these other things there, even though they're inert, they still have this information or this awareness of what's going on now. Thank you.
I knew this as a child.
So
Say,
this collective unconsciousness that's out there, though, is constantly evolving. Okay, it's not static. It's scanning, evolving all the time. So this leads to the creation of these archetypes that Jung talked about, or that Joseph Campbell popularized. And it also leads to the fact that you could, in these compactified dimensions, you could have, again, purely mental entities. So things like angels or a hierarchy of angels could be in these, just as mental entities could be existing there in these other subspaces. And so what Ron observed when we went back, and he had pictures of what the chakras look like. Let me just pick, I'm gonna flip for a second out of this to another thing on our page here, which is his observations on, hold on. Here we go. This is our resources page here. And so I'm going down the left-hand column. And again, this is what Ron observed, was this 26-dimensional space. So we're here with matter in 10 dimensions, but we only see these 3 for space and 1 for time. But we have another 6 spatial dimensions that are linked to the 3 spatial dimensions that we see around us. And it's in these dimensions that all of the activity takes place with the information and the scanning. And this is where we would, if I had a candidate, this would be where our, what we would call mind would be living here for something that's linked to a body. Over here next to it, we have this dark matter subspace, again, 10 dimensions, 3 for space, 1 for time, and 6 that are compactified. And so over here, this is where we would have the chakras existing, our souls or the spirits that link with this physical body over here, and they would link through these compactified dimensions. And then finally, at the very top, or in this picture at the bottom, there's a synchronization of all these different subspaces. Again, in what's going on here, there could be just purely mental entities, a whole hierarchy of these things that have evolved over trillions of years that are doing just God knows what, incredible things. So this is what Ron came up with here. And if we go down here, the way that he played it was that information, it underlies everything. So this is a picture of a hierarchy in science. We have physics at the bottom dealing with the fundamental nature of the particles and fields. But information is even more fundamental than that, because it is what is controlling the particles and fields. This information has that wherewithal to go do that. Then we go from physics to chemistry, where we start to put together atoms and molecules and so forth. So we end up with chemistry, and then we get up into biology, where we have living entities, for example. But information is everywhere in all these things. And here's an example. Ron looked at, this is an electron here, this thing here, and it's covered with, the electron is actually a torus. It's here's the hole through the middle of it. Looking down on it, here's the hole right in the middle. And then it's got these 10 strings wrapped around it that are oscillating all the time, but covering the whole thing. You see up here is what he called information blocks. They're covering everything here, covering the electron every which way, okay? And if we go down, I'm just looking at some other things here. They talked about the, what we have here is, for example, some of this dark matter, which would be making up, say, a chakra. And so initially it starts off and it's rooted like a fern. We have a root and then a bunch of branches. But there's so much dark matter out there that it starts to aggregate, and all of a sudden you have a very fleshed out fern here, here that makes up a chakra. Okay, this is how Ron observed the aggregation occurring. This is a very approaching a sentient entity here, and this thing down here is incredibly more complex. And it's evolved from that in just a short period of time, so that we end up with the ability to create hierarchies of complexity of what's going on. Here's a picture of the crown chakra that Ron put on the cover of his book. Nice little colored picture that you can see here. And this is all made up of this dark matter here, and so forth. So this is all on our resources page. And so now to go back to, I'm going to leave this and go back to, where did it go? Here. Hey, hold on. So this is what Descartes meant when he said, "I think, therefore I am." And the reason for bringing this up is I'm just trying to show you the power of the observations that Ron made. Okay, and you can see very deep. And they help to explain what's missing in modern physics, controlling everything. This is actually why things work. This information here controls all the particles and all the fields that are both making up matter and dark matter, and through the scanning process that Ron observed here. And it's a different viewpoint. It's a more complete viewpoint of what the world is around us. And of course, it'll be attacked, God knows how many different ways, but anyway. And the only thing I added here to this was to just try and put onto this a religious interpretation, a Christian Islamic interpretation, where we have these three Calabi-Yau subspaces. One's tied to matter, one's tied to dark matter, and one synchronizes those two. And so what we would have here is the Son, or Jesus of Nazareth, is the entity resident in the matter subspace, but the Holy Spirit is resident in the dark matter subspace, and what he called the Father is resident in this synchronizing subspace. So I think that Jesus of Nazareth simply chose these terms because who in the world is going to understand anything about compactified subspaces? Most of these people can't even read. So he's trying to come up with something that captures these ideas, but he does touch upon, there's all kinds of cherubim and seraphim and all hierarchies of angels and archangels out there. So there's incredible complexity that's continually evolving in these things, and these are entirely in the spiritual realm. Okay, the one thing to keep in mind is that there's no discussion here of being tied to any particular planet or any particular galaxy in the universe. And so you could think of these things being able to wander all over the place, which I think they actually do, but that's just me. A different way of looking at this was the Kabbalistic view, where the three Calabi-Yau manifolds had holes in them. Ron saw there were 3 holes for the matter subspace, 4 for the dark matter, and 8 for the synchronizing subspace. So if we connect the 3 holes in the matter subspace to the 3 holes in the synchronizing subspace, we lose 3 dimensions. We've got 18 dimensions here, 3 times 6. Each of the Calabi-Yau manifolds is 6-dimensional. So we have 18 dimensions total, but with these 3 holes tied together, we're down to 15. We look at the 4 holes in dark matter tied to the 4 holes in the synchronizing subspace, we're down to 11. And then finally, there's one hole left. There's 8 holes here. So this thing connects to itself, apparently. And now we're down to 10. So the end result is that we have 10 independent dimensions, which match the 10 Sephiroth of the Kabbalah. And this was observed by these mystics, right around the same time, 1000 BC, whatever. The Hindu or Buddhist view here, again, we have 3 major Hindu gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And so we can try and line these things up here to see where might they actually be resonant in. So the Hindu or Buddhist view of things, they actually saw these different things. They, instead of what Jesus called the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, they called Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And then finally, we go to the Egyptian side, and here I draw a blank. The Egyptians have Ra, and then a hierarchy here, and I've yet to figure. I counted. There's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I have 11 of these things here. So it isn't 10. You know, I don't know what the Egyptians were thinking. This is something to be worked on. Okay. So with that, let me get out of this. And I'm just trying to give you a flavor for probably this one thing is the greatest thing that Ron came up with here, looking at information as being an integral part of what we need to have a complete description of reality of the entire universe and how it appears in every place in the universe and evolves and is in all kinds of other aspects. And this will be something that people would be studying for, you know, centuries from now. It's incredibly rich. Bruce, any comments? Anything you want to say about? Did Ron ever really talk about this that much?
Well, he talked about how, well, he explained it to me like this, like he could, like he was observing an electron moving through space, and it would disappear, and then it would suddenly reappear. And his observation was that between those two places, it expanded to the entire universe.
Right, instantaneously.
Yeah.
The scan went to the far reaches of the universe.
Yeah.
Instantly, and it
Yeah.
came back again. And so everything is totally linked with everything else.
Yeah. In the universe, everything is, well, my favorite word for it is that it's integrated. Everything is intertwined with itself. This is one of the kind of the observations of the mind. Most people have a self. So you think everything is separated. Like you think there's a self and everything else is other. But when you get into the deeper meditation in Buddhism, for example, and my own experience, is that separation actually disappears.
Right.
You actually observe directly that everything is integrated. The laws of the universe, compassion, love, unfolding, everything is integrated. There's no separation at all.
Right.
It's just a matter of how much awareness you have. But the integration is obvious. And so this is, he was quite excited about that experience.
Yeah, it's really a very different way of viewing the world. Also, this was, by the way, what we talked about David Bohm, the physicist, and how the nature of physics, they came up with a probabilistic interpretation of how quantum mechanics works. But Bohm came up with a description of quantum mechanics where he said, actually, there's some extra variables that you never found. And those are the variables in these Calabi-Yau manifolds. And they link everything together. So everything really is deterministic. But as far as you're concerned in dealing with your calculations, you could interpret the calculations to be probabilistic. But at the end of the day, they're not. They're going to come out and follow these algorithms here. And of course, he proposed this, but in physics, ideas are cheap. What carries the day is data. What experiment can you run on this? And so Ron was the one who ran the experiment where he actually looked at what was going on. Like, for example, with the electron going through the 1 or 2 slits and becoming either a particle or wave, and scanning. If Bowman had that, he would have said, "My God, now I see what's really going on." Okay, but we'll see where it all goes. And this is something that anybody else can do, because you just have to learn to meditate like Ron, except he spent decades getting there. So,
And studying physics.
right.
Also, you have to keep in mind that Ron is a very old soul. So his depth of meditation is very deep. And so it's just part of his nature, because he's been doing it for thousands of lifetimes. Like, for example, just to give you an example of my own experience as Ron, is that he could read other people's minds. And he could look at somebody's mind and look into their previous lifetimes and look at their experiences of what made them who they are this lifetime. That was one of the marvelous things that I liked about Ron, is that he had that ability. So like it's really expansive stuff. Like it's I mean, we called we're the ones who are unconscious. The universe is very conscious.
Right. So anyway, so that's our piece of science for tonight, just to give people things to think about. It's called mind-body problem. It's got all the other things that you saw what it's called, but I think what Ron has come up with will be the point of view that carries the day, because it's actually based on these observations that other people simply weren't aware of. And so we'll see, as other people learn how to do this and duplicate these things, we'll see what happens. But it's going to be a sea change, I think.
Well,
So
eventually there's going to be another meditator who's going to come along and verify Ron's experiences, and then expand on it.
Right.
It's
Oh no, Ron would be the first to say that he
Yeah.
only scratched the surface. He
Yeah.
just ran out of time. Yeah.
Like, I mean, in Buddhism, like, you have these meditation masters. If they decided to do what Ron did, they could probably do it effortlessly. And that's the nature of the very evolved mind that's been around for a long time. They have these incredible capacities. I've watched them myself. I've had experiences directly with some of these people, and it's like, it blows your mind right off. It's really awesome stuff.
Right.
That's part of the nature of consciousness. It has the ability to observe these things quite effortlessly, as if it was just normal.
Right.
So it's and in a sense, that's where I see the Western approach to reality as being quite lacking. In fact, a lot of these things, in terms of the real spectacular meditators and who have incredible realization, take all this stuff for granted.
Right. Okay, we're going to let Marjorie.
Can I
now-
say one thing? So a lot of this, what you're talking about, or what you've explained, in somewhat in the layers, there's a lot of this embedded into the whole Waldorf or anthroposophical teachings. It's pretty amazing how there's a lot of overlap.
That's wonderful. Would you like to present something to us?
No, I'm a baby. I know little teeny bits, but not enough to articulate it in any intelligent way.
In the teachings, so just
No, I haven't read enough of Steiner. I mean, Steiner's stuff talks about all of this. Like, it's the different layers of angels and who does what, and the different energy, the consciousness of energy and what directs other. It's pretty and that, but also that connection to animals and plants and their consciousness level. because they have it, right? And so then how does we just can't understand, right? That, you know, like they're discovering now, right? Like if you say this, that the trees have this whole underground world, and right, they roots communicate and send, you know, whether you want to say fungi and bacteria and stuff back and forth. And if one's dying, they send out messages to the other to let them know that something's invading and share ways to protect themselves. I mean, so we don't understand any of the, we live in this place that, you know, we have this tiny little vision that is pretty skewed.
Actually, you know, what Ron is saying by looking at this is that the trees are actually, again, linked through this information flow. And it's the information that causes the bacteria and the roots to grow together and control these things, to make them behave that way. It's you have cause and effect. They don't realize that it's due to the information or the awareness or the you know, it's a type of consciousness that is what it is. So.
Well, and the whole, so this is in my field, which is not standard in medicine, but our gut biome is trillions and trillions of these bacteria and you know, viruses and all that kind of stuff. And we're basically a shell, right? Like we have this tiny, tiny piece is us, and the rest of us are all these millions of other organisms that are communicating and cause us to be able to live healthily, right?
Or
And
not.
we're in this germ phobia, like let's kill everything.
Yeah.
And we have mites on our eyelashes that have mites on them, you know, for like 3 levels. And
Right.
they're all part of that, you know,
And making it all work.
right, ecology.
I have a question, it kind of a non sequitur, but related. Has anyone ever attempted to do a 1-for-1 correlation between the hierarchy of Christian heaven with quantum, the quantum field? You know, in terms of the physics, so that
Project for you, Ed.
Yeah.
well, it was
Oh, yeah.
it was kind of interesting. It's building on the commentary of when Bart was going through all of the religions having all of these various different hierarchies, and then you can, you know, maybe it's just describing what's going on in the world of physics.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, just as one example, though, you take someone like Jesus of Nazareth, who, you know, by many measures was an amazing individual, but in this hierarchy that you're talking about of archangels and seraphim and cherubim, he's probably in the middle someplace. So figure out what these archangels are capable of doing. You know, he was amazing, but you know, there's other things that are even more mind-boggling.
Right. I was just wondering if anybody had attempted to.
No, that's to be done. I am going to go follow up on Judith though, and go look at what Steiner and these people had to say, and see if we can pull something together.
Nancy.
Yeah, because they
Nancy.
do talk about all the different levels of the angels and what they do and who's in charge of what. And it is pretty fascinating how, you know, and they're very, like in the Waldorf education, they're very much, you know, and some of it's changing because the level of foo-fooism that people can't tolerate. But part of what they do is they try to teach the teachers to meditate on their students, right? To really, because the teacher stays with the kids for multiple years, and it's really about meditate on that child so that you fully understand what they need to move them to the next, right? So they're very much about that, not just the physical, right? Not just what you're seeing in front of you, but what's the more complete life of the child, which there's a lot we don't see.
Yeah, or that was our Ho'oponopono, you know, trying to drive things in that direction. So,
Like one of the ways I look at it is that it's just a matter of awareness. Like there are people, quite a few people have the depth of awareness that Ron had, but it's not all that uncommon. I mean, they may be very few in number, but it's not all that difficult or uncommon. It may be difficult in the fact that these people who do have this incredible depth of awareness are
Yeah,
very old souls.
The Dalai Lama,
Yeah, for example,
how many levels of awareness does he have?
yeah. And he also says he's just starting to learn, I mean, but that's the dimension in the Western way of thinking is the lack of awareness. Like they just don't have any idea that you can actually be aware of subatomic particles if you chose to do so.
That's what I was going to say. I think it is natural and intuitive to understand these things, but it's actually kind of suppressed by our education system in the West. And in the West, these things are considered kind of esoteric. If you go into it at all, it's, as Nancy was saying, it's frou-frou and it's esoteric. It's a little more accessible, I think, in the East, and kind of take it seriously and take it for granted. It's more matter of fact. But like Steiner is considered esoteric, in the West. It really shouldn't be. But I was writing, I have them in my old computer and I have to translate everything to get it out of there. But I want to have a bookmarker for poems that I was writing. I have a couple in my teens. And that was before I had studied anything esoteric. I kind of did that because I felt like I needed to be more grounded. I needed my thinking to be more organized and just, grounded and formalized, because it was just kind of all over the place when I was just on my own with my own intuition. And I didn't have any community around me of anybody to turn to. I think I was lucky that my parents had both studied a lot of science and math and physics, and had very active imaginations and intellects, but they were horrified when I went in the direction of psychology, astrology. They just thought that was an aberration.
Right.
I'd like to give you just an example of, like I had a guru, also I had the luck of being telepathic, but I had the ability to experience his love and compassion mind. And it's like experiencing an atomic bomb in terms of vast reality that just it is unbelievable. I mean, these guys have that kind of stuff, these masters.
Yeah. And there's levels of master.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else?
Stephen hasn't said a word.
I'm listening and chewing. That's why. I will say one thing that popped into my head regarding the consciousness of all things, if you will, and that has to do with my general inability to attribute characteristics to the normal astrological signs and so on. But if you visit that areas of space and the different houses, if you will, have different consciousnesses, and that consciousness drives attitudes and behaviors, and sort of when in Rome, do as the Romans do. If you find yourself in this house or that house, it might make some sense that there would be aspects of personality that could be attributed to this different consciousness found here and there.
That's really kind of Bart's understanding of astrology, actually.
Yeah.
And I will say that astrologers, particularly the kind of astrology that I studied, and I went on my own to kind of integrate it with Jungian astrology and psychology. We talk about thought forms. So yes, for example, the signs are thought forms that people have spent thousands and thousands of years projecting up into different slices of the sky. Looking at the sky as 360 degrees around us. Each sign is 30 degrees, so there are 12 of them. We think there used to be 13. But 12 times 30 is 360 degrees. So there were, from this perspective, and here's where the mind comes in, which is so interesting. Those are ancient thought forms that people of all different cultures have very similar associations with. And they weren't necessarily in physical contact with each other, these people. So it could be that there's something, but like the constellation doesn't really exist. That's just from our point of view that those stars align in a certain pattern. But their depth, their relationships are actually, light years apart. In depth, it's only from this angle that they line up to look like a horse or whatever it is at all. So it's very much a mental thing. But astrology recognizes that. We're saying that those thought forms have their own objective existence, and that a lot of energy has accumulated over the thousands and thousands of years. And we think that these things have come and gone over the years with, Atlantis, or, that civilizations have come and gone that are more ancient than our Greek or Mesopotamian or Egyptian cultures. So those thought forms have been either stimulated by the entities out there, and like the Pleiades. It seems like almost every culture talks about them as having a consciousness.
Right.
What they are actually there to each other, who knows? We don't really know if space is even real. I don't think it is what we think it is, and apparently that distance doesn't really matter. And the dimensions can be folded up, just like the DNA. If you spread it out, it's how long is it?
2 meters.
2 meters, but when it's folded up, it's like, this big, but they're all enfolded and they're compactified segments of this DNA. So they're not far time and space work. And that's how, aliens, quote unquote, they may be angels, from another dimension, who knows? But I think that's how they travel. They're not really traveling a great distance. They're doing something with their consciousness to fold up the dimensions, and then it's next door. I don't think they're using rockets, with any kind of fuel like that. I think it's a far more consciousness thing. But I just would like to bookmark this discussion because I want to come back to it to just sort of share my hypothesis that I was thinking thoughts like this without any influence when I was quite young. And it's what led me to study the so-called occult, and esoteric systems, because I needed something to help me organize it. And like I said, to become more grounded. And I thought, well, maybe the ancients knew something that we've forgotten. That was just like an instinctive question in my mind. That was a hypothesis when I started exploring it all, and that is what I found. But as I've said, it took me like 3 years to actually get to where it actually made sense. But I was doing it on a kind of faith for the first year. So I just wanted to share the work of a poet. It's another poet that I wrote an essay about on this kind of intersection of consciousness and reality and spirituality, and how serious it can be. And this is another poet that I was introduced to when I was doing that academic research and writing. It felt like just a blessing to encounter her. I had heard of her, but not really encountered her. And then, so hopefully you can keep this bookmark in mind for things I'd like to bring up next week. Her name is Denise Levertov, and this is one of her well-known poems. It's The Blue Rim of Memory. And what I like about it is the way she's talking about psychological and emotional realities as phenomena, as an objectively existing fact. It's our experience is real. It's not just an epiphenomenon of the brain. It is something in itself. So she says, the way sorrow enters the bone is with stabs and hoverings. From a torn page, a cabriolet that's like a stagecoach, not really a wagon. What's a carriage? A carriage approaches over the crest of a hill. First the nodding, straining head of the horse, then the blind lamps peering. The ladies within the insect eagerly look from side to side, awaiting the vista, and quick as a knife are vanished. Who were they? Where is the hill? Or from stoked fires of nevermore, a warmth constant as breathing hovers out to surround you. A cloud of mist becomes rain, becomes cloak, then skin. The way sorrow enters the bone is the way fish sink through dense lakes, raising smoke from the depths and flashing sideways in bedeviled syncopations. It's the way snow drains the light from day, but then, covering boundaries of road and sidewalk, widens wandering streets and stains the sky yellow to glow at midnight. I think this is one that improves by savoring it, by reading it a few times, so you'll have it. This 2002 was a very rich year for me, and it was the year that my father died, who I was close to but had a very complicated relationship with. So there's my bio. We were supposed to propose call outs for the book that this was to be included in, and this was one I said, for Levertov, a poem is a record of the moment by moment interaction between consciousness and natural phenomena. In The Blue Rim of Memory, Denise Levertov wastes no time in building subtly to her point, and little or no interpretation is required in even the first reading of the poem. By the third word of the first line, the reader knows without mystique or ambiguity exactly what the poem is about. The way sorrow enters the bone. The poem proceeds from that wide open aperture in a manner hovering between clinical detachment and reporting with anatomical precision the phenomenology of sorrow as such, and paradoxically, a discreet, understated tenderness toward the experience of pain. But because of this dual directionality, zeroing in on the sensation of sorrow, while simultaneously distancing from any accompanying emotionality, the poem never quite yields its detachment to the point of sympathy or detaches to the point of total abstraction. Levertov brings the phenomenon of sorrow as it is in and of itself into such sharp relief that the particulars become irrelevant, even irreverent. Such narrative questions as what sorrow, which sorrow, whose sorrow, sorrow over what, who caused the sorrow, sorrow for yourself or another, personal sorrow, Weltschmerz, world sorrow, whither before the simple fact of sorrow is a universal human experience in and of itself. The source is not important, and neither is the context. This close disciplined cropping of the frame forces a more intimate look at the specific experience of sorrow as a distinctly human experience, as universal, natural, and inevitable breathing, as life itself, as death itself for that matter. The close focus suspends judgment or correction or even palliative comfort or rationalization mid-sentence. Left to the astonished state of recognition beyond words, even if it is through words that one is brought there, the reader is invited to consider how sorrow, once within the realm of experience, informs life from that point forward. Does it, as Levertov suggests in her final image of falling snow, make day darker and night lighter? Does this particular loss of innocence perhaps dampen joy and simultaneously lighten subsequent sorrows? Is this what it means to move out of childhood's bliss? These are the questions left to consider beyond the particularization of the experience. Levertov is more concerned with evoking the distinct sensation of sorrow than explaining or even describing it, let alone answering the ultimate burning question of why. The image is employed are neither sad nor personal. They reach beyond sentiment, beyond emotion even, and beyond interpersonal relations and situations, in comparison certainly, into universal nature. There is no protest against human action or fate, no cry of injustice or remorse. There is just a simple fact of this experience entering the bone, as right as rain, or as deceptively as fish sinking and then flashing silver through clouded water. A rite of passage as eternal as day passing into night. To know is initiation into the human condition, nothing more, nothing less. There are no mentions of Bach suites for cello, no candles flickering in churches, no mourners dressed in black. There are no such familiar touchstones of personal loss and sadness. There is only the strictest attention to the sensation of the knowing of sorrow, sorrow which is here to stay. Levertov does not proffer the hope that it will season and temper its host like fine wine, if one is very good or wise or lucky, or warn that it may char or curdle if not. We have entered a realm beyond good and evil, beyond the solace of comprehension or redemption. This is a realm of pure phenomenon, of pure experience, beyond, you could say, the reach of reason. And where reason leaves off is where faith picks up, if one can push through that stubborn membrane. This is where Levertov is taking us, through the liminal line of rationality, across the threshold of the mind, and through the void of despair on the other side of that, which, if one can keep going, the mystics tell us, becomes a transitional bardo, an in-between zone, leading to a new life on the other side. This kind of detachment from personal identity and context often tends toward dissociation altogether into the surreal, into completely disembodied abstraction. But this poem permits only one lapse in this direction in the second stanza, where the image of a cabriolet suddenly veers off the page into an Edward Gorey grotesque cartoon landscape, and we glimpse the ladies within the insect. This one exception contrasts Levitov's otherwise consistent use of concrete imagery from nature. Here we can recognize the mind's tendency in moments of crisis and severe shock to juxtapose the absurdly comic with horror. For the most part, however, the concreteness and simplicity of the poem's imagistic analogies mitigate against floating off into the surreal dissociation of the bizarre. And the poem's evoked recognitions are very much anchored in the real, nearly in the physical body itself. There's a certain acceptance of the naturalness of sorrow and its very inevitability. There is no conditional if, there is only the ineluctable when. This is the way it is. However, this acceptance does not constitute a lesson or a moral, or embody an attitude or give an ethos. It is simply acknowledging a fact of life, a fact of unalterable natural law, honoring its existence by painting its portraits as vividly as possible, with words calling forth images that form familiar but startling analogies. This matter-of-fact acceptance of experience has come to strike the modern Western sensibility as rather zen in its detached, compassionate examination. But is this quality not a legitimate claim of the poet's natural place as observer, as prophet, as outsider of the view? While Levertov's mature personal spirituality reclothed itself in the Christian traditions of her youth, her work seems to transcend categorization, as all true spirituality does. One can see traces here and there in her work of various traditions. Here a little Zen, there a little Kabbalah, here a Gnostic streak. And indeed, as Levertov's path at various points in her life has wandered through each of these gardens, it has gathered their various hues and shades and depths along the way. Here, very much a poet of the mystical order, what Levertov served devotional apprenticeships to both H.D., that's Hilda Doolittle, and Rainer Maria Rilke can be seen in her own combined mystic lyricism and precise imagery. As the function of the mystic is not to seek analysis or conclusion, but to deepen the sense of mystery, this poem may raise more questions than it answers. In this tradition, this would definitely be seen as a good thing. The second line describes the workings of the poem. The way sorrow enters the bone is with stabs and hoverings. The poem itself brings sudden moments of startled, piercing awareness, intermixed with a more oblique, subtler realizations. A cloud of mist becomes rain, becomes cloak, then skin. So it is with sorrow as well. It comes quickly and slowly, in sharp increments, penetrating to the core, and in gradual layerings over time, until it does become a part of one's being. And beyond that, sorrow becomes not only an indelible part of one's experience, but a part of one's experiencing from that point forward. Perhaps the blue rim is the lens through which experience must now on filter as it penetrates and ultimately becomes self. I'm a Westerner. Knife and mist are alchemically combined in the final stanza. Fish sink through dense lakes, raising smoke from the depth, flashing sideways in deviled syncopation. It is the startling use of familiar, everyday, and otherwise innocuous imagery against the field of the subject of sorrow that creates the confluence of content and form in a sense of awe-inspiring mystery. It could be thought of as a higher order of onomatopoeia, almost like a pun between image and meaning, which sets the mystical imagistic poets apart from their more sentimental or prosaic cousins. Levertov's colleague Robert Quealy asserted that form is never more than an extension of content, to which Levertov added, form is never more than a revelation of content. Some might say it is the function of any art to join the life of the inner self with the inner life of the outer world. But it is without question the task of Levertov's poetic tradition. As she put it so succinctly herself in her appreciation of H.D.'s work, who I highly recommend, Levertov is concerned with the interplay of psychic and material life. For Levertov, a poem is a record of the moment-by-moment interaction between consciousness and natural phenomena, whether they be wholly inner experiences or encounters with the outer world of nature. In the blue rim of memory, we see a master at work, confidently and quietly sculpting, summoning the very mystery of existence into being. We may never know the why of any of it, why we are alive, why we feel, why we love, why we gain, why we lose. But the fact that we are alive and do experience at all is miracle enough. As Denise Levertov reminds us in the stabbing and hovering meditation on the human experience of sorrow. So that's me.
Any comments or anything?
You write so beautifully.
Oh, thank you.
Amazing.
I'm just gonna try and close it out with a,
I just have to say, I am dizzy from the idea that this was 20 years ago.
How long did it take you to write such a piece? I'm just curious.
I think I had about 2 weeks to do it.
Wow.
2 weeks and 35 years. Yeah.
And what was it that, do you remember what the moment where you decided I'm going to write this, and what moved you to like actually take the action?
It was actually an assignment.
Okay.
I had a choice, among, like a dozen different things. But the editor of the volume was looking for somebody to write about this particular poem. And so I found the poem and I liked it so much, I decided to, then there's kind of a cattle call, and there's a bunch of competing people trying to get various assignments.
Mm-hmm.
So
Wow.
I was glad to be, selected to write about it. I had read somewhat about it and about her, as well as the poem. But for me, it was about just exactly what this class was about. It's a mysterious encounter between consciousness and reality
Hmm.
that we don't, we don't really understand. And I don't know if we ever fully can, but I feel like for me, good art opens up the mystery. It 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 helps penetrate and expand the mystery rather than attempting to close it up, which is what I think bad science does.
Hmm.
These kind of silly explanations for things. It's like, well, we don't understand photosynthesis. We don't understand anything.
Hmm.
The more you look at it, I think the more mysterious it is, and the more complex the unity is.
And yet we do then see certain things that appear too. We get insights, we get little glimpses of things
Right.
by
And then you get this like a diamond, and I've written about like we can together we have this kind of diamond mind.
Hmm.
You get these facets of different people's points of view. To me, that's really fascinating. I think that's what James Joyce was all about. It's this kind of cubist perspective of these, multiple points of view. I don't know how else to put it, which to me is just endlessly fascinating. It's like a kaleidoscope or that it just keeps shifting, and each one of us, and this is a Jewish tradition, each one of us contains a universe.
Mm-hmm.
And when one of us dies, a universe dies.
Hmm.
So for me, all of that is beautiful. It adds to the complexity of the unity.
Yeah, it's not as simple as we like to think sometimes.
Marjorie, what was your conclusion about the line of the ladies and the insect?
That was a moment of, surrealness that I think is often part of the experience of sorrow, or maybe any really intense emotion, that things become. That she was talking about a carriage that can look like an insect, and I thought of Edward Gorey's drawings of the ladies in the carriages, that I guess it's like a little flash of madness that you can have in a very intense emotional state, but that's how it looked to her.
I when I see things like that, the place I visit is one of an equation such that the ladies, it would be a behavioral equation of the stereotypical behavior of the ladies would be equal to the stereotypical behavior of the insects, that this orderly behavioral and knowing and doing what one is supposed to do, when and how one is supposed to do it in this very orderly, methodical way. That's how I look at it, rather than as a surreal kind of, of literally seeing ladies within an insect. So,
Okay, well, I like that. Yeah, I think you're saying like insects are so programmed, apparently, we think.
and ladies have been so programmed over the millennia.
Right. And I think that's a kind of tongue-in-cheek word for her. She's not saying women, the ladies, you know, it's ironic, I would say. So I think you're right. I like that.
So you're saying, Stephen, that it's like the ladies are like an ant colony with the queen, and all of the ants are doing their job according to their roles. And it's very predictable.
Well,
Right.
I think so. It's not as if the men didn't have their predictable roles, but the ladies definitely, you know, had a more limited role. You know, they had fewer opportunities and fewer choices that were available.
Hmm.
So,
You know, that's interesting. I need to like go understand more the roles of the ants and the ant colony, of the males and females, and seeing what their roles are and like which ones go out and which ones stay in. And that's pretty cool.
I think traditionally the women were often really responsible for the job funeral, you know, of cleaning the body and, you know,
Oh, yeah.
doing it and getting the food ready. You know, there always has to be a spread. And so that's, you know, that's kind of their job, is to tidy things up around death, you know. That's what I,
Well, they kind of carried the sorrow too, right? The men had the jobs, they continued about life couldn't stop. You know, you still had to go to the bank, you still had to, you know, if that was where you worked, or you still had to, you know, do your cases or see your patients, whereas the women could, right, carry the ritual that needed to be carried.
yeah, and feel the feelings.
Mhm.
You know, I think a lot of
Mm.
times men still are not allowed to feel their feelings of sorrow, any vulnerable feelings, or, you know.
Mm.
Mhm.
I think that women were granted both the luxury and the pain of being able to feel and express emotion.
Yeah, yeah, for better and for worse, yes. Exactly.
Mm. Mm.
So I'm looking at the time, and I think we'll just
Interesting.
punt and push the meditation piece off to next week. We're at the end of, we only have one more piece of the book of Radically Happy. So why don't we call it a night and have a great weekend, and we will reconvene.
Same bat
Good.
time, same bat channel next week.
Thank you both. Thank you, everybody.
Okay,
Take
thank
care.
you.
For some reason, my camera worked just because I said maybe my camera will work. And I just clicked and it
Thanks.
worked.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye, have a good week.
Good night, everybody.